So, everyone, welcome back to the She Really Gets It podcast. I'm Stefanie Rhodes, health educator and reformed public health professional. And in this week's episode, we will be discussing inequity in disaster response and recovery. And here to discuss that with us is Jen Grice. Jen is currently the Director of Emergency Management for Alachua County, Florida. She has a master's in public health and has a designation of a Florida Professional Emergency Manager. Did I say that correctly, Jen?
You did.
Okay. And Jen has served in 9 federally or state declared disasters, most recently Hurricane Nicole. It has my middle name. I like that, but I don't like that. But I don't know. There's yet to be a Hurricane Stefanie, so.
Yeah, I'm still waiting for the Hurricane Jen, so we'll see.
That would be amazing. I feel like I would like that. Jen.
Oh, Jen. Yes. It's simple.
It is. So, welcome to the show, Jen. And I have to apologize to you because I was so late today and the universe was just doing things with technology. So, my apologies.
No worries. Just happy to be here.
And so we're discussing inequity in disaster response and recovery. And before we even get into inequity, what does the field of disaster response actually entail? Like, what does it cover? Because I just think of hurricanes and tornadoes, but I know that's a very simplified version of what you actually do.
Yeah, so I wish it was just tornadoes and hurricanes. That would really narrow our scope quite a bit, but in emergency management, we use the term all hazards to kind of describe the scope of our responsibilities. So, in addition to the tornadoes and hurricanes and other natural disasters, we also handle man-made and technological disasters. So, and humanitarian crises. So civil unrest, hazardous material spills, pandemics, which are all very familiar with at this point, failures in infrastructure. So all of those sorts of large scale incidents that would require a larger scale response are sort of the things that emergency management gets involved in. And kind of our role within that response is to coordinate and support the efforts that are happening on scene in response to the incident. So there's the on scene responders, who are directly working the disaster, and then emergency management and our partner agencies. We're kind of behind the scenes in the Emergency Operations Center, working to coordinate the higher level stuff to make sure that the people on the ground have the resources and information they need to do their job.
Okay, wow. When you said the whole thing about it's about also infrastructure and failures in it, it made me think of in regards to inequity, it made me think about like how communities are designed. And I know the majority of Black people live around other Black people, the majority of white people live around other white people, and that's just how we've designed communities. Does that come into play when it comes to disaster response and recovery in terms of how people are placed or displaced?
Absolutely. So, one of the biggest things that I think about when it comes to inequity, I think about flooding and Hurricane Katrina. So I lived in New Orleans when Katrina happened, and it was really the lowest lying areas of the city that fared the worst with the flooding, which is to be expected. Water flows down. The thing is, though, is that a lot of those low-lying flood-prone areas are where Black, Latino, and other minority groups are likely to live. And, this really goes back to land valuation. So a property that is likely to experience flooding, it's less desirable and therefore undervalued, the exception being those $1 million mansions that we see along the coast. So the communities that have largely developed in those lower lying areas are often made up of people with lower incomes because the land's cheaper, and those folks are largely racial minority groups. So flood risk is really associated with and often a product of that broader systemic issue of racial inequity that has pushed people of color into more vulnerable areas.
Oh, wow. Okay. So when it comes to actual recovery, because I remember Hurricane Katrina, I was in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, at LSU when that happened. And when I think about just the amount of time that it took to even start the process of recovery was ridiculous and didn't seem to make sense. Was that also tied to like who was most affected, or how does that work when it comes to the actual process of like recovery post disaster?
So I think there are a few different things that slow down the recovery process. One is things move at the speed of government. I don't think the government is known for being the fastest moving of entities. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing I think with recovery is it's important, especially, now I think emergency managers are looking at it a lot more, is how to rebuild in a way that addresses some of the climate change issues that we're seeing, and building so that we don't have these issues again. So I know that there's a lot more thought that's being put into how we're addressing recovery. On an individual perspective, though, when a disaster area is federally declared, it does take a little bit of time for those resources to trickle down to the local communities to get that financial assistance. And then, you have to make sure that those folks know that those resources are available, because, we can't just assume that people know that, hey, there's this money available to you to help you rebuild and recover from the disaster. So there's a messaging piece to it as well.
Okay. And what kind of improvements are being made into like messaging and getting it out to like the most affected communities?
So one of the things that we do in my office, we use our emergency notification system to push out as messages as far as we can. We actually pay a lot of money to have access to the cell phone information of most of the folks who live within my county, so that we're able to actually ping most of those cell phones. I've also worked with our GIS folks to geo-target areas that we know are more socially vulnerable. So during the COVID-19 pandemic, we were able to specifically target certain areas with additional messaging to make sure that we got the word out about vaccines or whatever the push was at the time.
Yeah, because I think when people think of emergency management and disaster response, we don't think of pandemics. So, what is a specific role that you've done in a pandemic? I think we only had one in our lifetime. So, what is the role of emergency management in a pandemic?
So, let me start by saying that the COVID-19 pandemic was by far the most grueling incident I have ever worked. It was really like sprinting a marathon.
Yeah.
If you can imagine that. So for emergency management, I think the role kind of varies by jurisdiction. And I think a lot of it depends on how strong a jurisdiction's local health department is. Okay. So for my particular county, we're really fortunate to have a health department that really understands the need to prepare for pandemics and really everything. They are super prepared for all hazards, and I am so grateful for that. So for Alachua County, for COVID-19, our health department, they handled the testing, contact tracing, and then when we finally got to the vaccine portion of this pandemic, they did the vaccine rollout as well, and we handled a lot of their logistical needs to support their operation. Our EOC was activated for 27 weeks. I'll never forget the day that we first activated. It was March 16th of 2020.
So what's an EOC?
Oh, it's Emergency Operations Center. That's where we coordinate disasters. So yeah, we activated in March of 2020 for 27 long weeks. Some of the things that we did, since the health department handled a lot of the public health stuff, one of the biggest things was just the consequence management of the pandemic. So we saw, I'm sure as you're aware, a huge increase in food insecurity because folks, they lost their jobs or they were immunocompromised, so they couldn't go to the grocery store. So we worked with our partner agencies, food banks, to establish food distributions. And we did this a couple of different ways. We did direct deliveries to households. And then we also did what's called a point of distribution, which is basically like a drive-through where cars just come through and we load their trunks with food and they head on their way. So food distribution was one thing we coordinated. Also, a lot of public information. We have a public information officer in our emergency operations center. I don't think I need to tell you about all of the misinformation that was flying around throughout COVID and continues to this day. So it was really a challenge to combat that misinformation. Yeah. But we have a duty as public servants to make sure that we're pushing out the best information to our residents. So, science-based information that informed our public was really where we focused our public information efforts. And then, of course, letting people know where they can get vaccines or where they can get tested, things like that. Probably the biggest thing that emergency management did with COVID was logistics. Yeah. So, when we have every other disaster I've worked, most of our resource requests have been from our core partner agencies, people that we're used to seeing, and they're requesting stuff from us. But with COVID, we were inundated with requests from tons of healthcare agencies. So our hospitals, we have 3 hospitals in Alachua County, nursing homes, assisted living facilities, even smaller facilities like group homes, they all needed PPE to stay in business and keep their guests safe. Yeah. So we coordinated a lot of the logistics to make sure that they had the stuff that they needed to stay in business. And then I think the last biggest thing that we did was what's called non-congregate sheltering, which was basically we provided hotel rooms to people who tested positive for COVID and they weren't able to isolate in their homes. So that included people who are experiencing homelessness. So we put them up in a hotel for a number of days until they no longer had COVID, made sure that they had food. And then we worked with some healthcare partners to make sure that they checked in on them to see how they were doing with their symptoms. So those are probably the biggest areas that, at least in my county, we worked on. Yeah. And, again, we're lucky that we have a strong health department that was able to take on a lot of the public health side of the response to the pandemic.
Yeah. And when I think about COVID, I think of it as exposing a lot of the cracks in our healthcare system and a lot of the disparities that exist in terms of like social class and race and, just the full gamut, ability status. How did that show up for you, or rather just from your perspective as an emergency management professional?
Well, so I think one of the biggest things we saw was just how much COVID disproportionately affected minority communities. I think more deaths, more severe outcomes, and that's a huge issue. Getting messaging to our entire population so that everyone understands how serious this is, and this is where you can go to get tested and treatment and all of those things. It's a real challenge, and I think that it affected our minority communities way more than other communities.
Yeah. And how did you address that then? And like going in the future, did that change anything about like how you will address those issues, like going into the future, or how you might plan in the future? What does that look like?
So one of the biggest tools that I'm looking at now is the CDC's Social Vulnerability Index. That really outlines the communities that are the most vulnerable to disasters, to pandemics, to anything that we might face. So I use that to really look at the communities that I need to target with messaging, with information, with resources when something happens, because our affluent communities, they're most likely going to be okay after a disaster. If we can pull our resources to where they're actually needed, we'll be able to recover a lot quicker and a lot stronger.
Yeah. And what are often the challenges to pulling those resources to where they're needed? Or are there any challenges to pulling them to where they're needed?
So I think one of the challenges is just the perception that you're not providing equitably for your community. Um, we want to support our entire community, but equitable doesn't mean necessarily that everyone gets the same thing.
Yeah.
It means that some communities need more to make themselves whole again.
Yeah.
So I think it's really important to kind of frame that with the public who would get upset if they're not getting as many resources as another community, because maybe they don't need as much as this other community.
Yeah. And I think that's a challenge in public health, especially when it comes to like making certain changes. People, because the people with, I think, just bad intentions in general will be like, they're trying to make things, they're doing things special for the Latino community. They don't want to, instead of like white people or this group. And it's like, well, okay, this one has this particular disparity, so we need to put more money in this particular group. Or Indigenous women there's a disparity here in terms of like how they've historically been treated. So in order to make them whole again, they're going to need more than your community, and I think people forget that, like, why are we getting things different? It's like, well, the goal is never equality, because we're not, in terms of how we've been treated historically, we're not been treated equally, and that has long-term consequences. So I like that you brought that up of like, it's not about equal, it's about making it equitable and making everyone whole. And what does it take to make everyone whole?
For sure.
So, Jen, when I think about like disaster responses, there's something I feel like there's something I might not be asking about or covering. I've I've learned from just doing some research this week, that there's a role of emergency management in criminal justice as well. Am I right about that, or is that true? And if so, what does that look like?
So I wouldn't say that emergency management plays a huge role within the criminal justice system. At least I don't think that my office does. But what I will say, though, is that we do have to respond to and prepare for some of the consequences of the things that happen within the criminal justice system. So we did a lot of contingency planning with our partners to plan for scenarios where protests turn violent. And of course, a lot of the protests that we've seen were because of things happening within the criminal justice system. So that's been kind of the intersection for me, is responding to and planning for things that have happened within the criminal justice system.
Okay.
So the one thing, since we're talking about equity, that I would bring up for emergency management, I think, is just the makeup of people who work in emergency management. Yeah. So we have a diversity problem within this field. So I have a couple statistics, and I first saw these on Twitter a while ago, and then of course verified them. But so more than 62% of emergency management directors are male, and 71% are white. And on average, they make $15,000 more than their female counterparts. The next statistic is only 11.7% of emergency management directors are persons of color. So this field is largely dominated by white males, and I'm not knocking my white male colleagues. I know a ton of amazing emergency managers who fit that description. The issue, though, is that the lack of diversity in this field leads to lack of diverse perspectives. So there's a big push right now in the EM community to increase diversity. We need more women, we need more people of color. We need people to take an interest in emergency management and choose it as their career. I think that as we increase diversity, it will be one of the biggest drivers of change as far as addressing some of the issues that we're seeing in equity within disaster response and recovery.
Yeah, actually, I'm glad you brought that up, because I was thinking about even, looking at going back to Hurricane Katrina, and I remember like the Red Cross being there, and I was looking at, you have the Red Cross volunteers and you have the people that are being served. And I've seen like one group looks one way. I'm seeing the volunteers that are all white, and I'm seeing people being served that are all black. And you sometimes see these interactions that are not great. Not all bad, but not great. And you see that kind of like miscommunication or tension. And so for me, what can we do in order to make the field more diverse? Because I know, like in public health, my main frustration when I first came into this field was everything was unpaid internship or very, very, very low paying position. It was like positions that I could not afford to take, right? Opportunities I simply could not financially afford. Um, what is being done in the field of emergency management really to open those doors and making it a more feasible field for people of color?
So I think one of the biggest things that I'm seeing is just a better telling of our story.
Yeah.
For a long time, people have thought of emergency management as a kind of a first responder, lights and sirens type of job. And that's not everyone's cup of tea. And that's not my cup of tea. I'm not a first responder. This is really a high level critical thinking job. It is project management with an emphasis on public safety. And that is something I think that is of interest to a larger group of people than that first response type of job. So there are some groups out there that are doing great work in this space. One that comes to mind, it's called the Institute for Diversity and Inclusion in Emergency Management. So they're kind of hitting it two different ways. Just increasing the visibility of the field is kind of one of their missions. And then the other side of it is actually increasing the assistance and equity within disaster response. So, for instance, during Hurricane Ian, folks from IDM went down to Southwest Florida and actually went into these communities to talk with their residents and actually listen to them and see what their needs are. So I think one of the biggest things is just the more we see folks of different backgrounds, the more people will want to be in this field. FEMA has their first female administrator, which is huge. I'm a big believer of if you can see it, you can be it. And, I had never seen a female in that role. And I think for people of color, it's probably the same thing. If you don't see it, you don't feel like you can be it. So I think the more that we get folks into these roles, the more people want to come into emergency management. I love this profession. I think it's awesome. I get super excited talking about it. No 2 days are the same for me. It's a great job. Obviously, working disasters can be a little stressful, but it's such a rewarding career field, and we need more perspectives in this field to really broaden our horizons and where we take our preparedness and response efforts.
Going forward, if people want to learn more about emergency management, how to get into the field of emergency management, do you have any resources, recommendations, websites that you might recommend for them?
Yeah, so there are a couple good, groups that you can join. So there's the International Association of Emergency Managers. So a lot of great information there. And then in Florida, we have the Florida Emergency Preparedness Association. So those are probably two of the best resources for learning more about emergency management. And I also just encourage people, when I finished school with you and I moved to crazy Florida, I knew I wanted to be in emergency management, but I didn't know what that was exactly. I was drawn to it because of my personal experience with disasters. And so I did some research and figured out that disasters happen at the local level. So whenever you see a disaster, it's always happening. The county is in charge of it, and then it goes up to the state and the federal government. But at the end of the day, the county has overall jurisdiction for that. So the first thing I did was figure out, what county am I living in? I just got into Florida. So I figured out what county I lived in and then actually reached out to the emergency management director in that county to have a conversation with him. And that's really kind of what started my career, was finding someone locally to be that mentor for me.
Yeah, and I like that you said that. I think sometimes people are afraid when they want to go into a field to make calls on their own behalf.
Well, I needed to make calls because I needed a job. So
that's how it works though. Like,
yeah.
guess what? I've been there. It's like, listen, no one else is gonna make this call for me. Let me make a call on my own behalf.
Exactly.
And I was like, it's perfectly okay to do that. Like, that's how that works. And especially for like younger people, especially people that are minorities, women, people of color, different ability statuses. Don't be afraid to pick up the phone, go online, look up who's who, and make calls on your own behalf. I think it's one of those great lessons that people don't always like tell you about, but it's like, you're looking for a job. When you're desperate, you find a way. And also, like, you're needed, but not people aren't always going to tell you that you're needed. So making those calls on your own behalf, it's the way to go. So I'm glad you brought that up. I think some people think like we just kind of fall into things, it just happens, as opposed to like, no, if it's something that you really want, make it happen. You were just in Hurricane Nicole.
Yes.
How was that?
It wasn't too bad for my county. Obviously, the East Coast had a pretty bad time, especially along the beaches. But we were, for the most part, okay in my county. But even not getting hit too bad is still a huge logistical undertaking.
Yeah.
We opened shelters for Nicole and for Ian. And just mobilizing people to open shelters, and it involves closing schools, and it's a whole thing. So
Yeah.
it's a huge decision to make, and we don't take the decision lightly, but we have to make sure our residents and visitors are safe. So we did end up doing that for both of those storms.
Yeah. Jen, I have to ask you a more serious question, because I've been thinking about buying a house, and I'm afraid to buy one because of climate change, and I'm afraid some horrible storm is going to come through and rip the roof off of my house. What is your advice as an emergency management professional?
Number one piece of advice I can give is find out if the house is in a flood zone.
Okay.
Like, please, I do not recommend buying a house in a flood zone, especially with just, we're having 100-year floods like every other year in some place, crazy frequency for these 100-year floods. Like, we need to adjust the timeline. It's not 100-year anymore. But so all of these places that are like, everything's fine here, they're flooding, and it's a huge issue. So, and in addition to that, you have to pay for flood insurance if you live in a flood zone. So that's an extra expense. And of course, interest rates are going up. So, the more you can keep costs down, the better. So definitely stay away from flood zones. That's really my biggest tip. And then, look for a house it's built to a good construction code. Some of the older homes, especially down here in Florida, our building codes improved, I think, after Hurricane Andrew, looking to make sure that your house was built to a good standard. Oh, and the other thing about flood insurance, so there's a 30-day waiting period. So, say there's a hurricane coming and you're like, oh, crap, let me get flood insurance because this hurricane's headed my way. You won't be covered for that hurricane because it won't kick in until 30 days after you've gotten the policy. So I think that's kind of a way of making sure that folks aren't just picking up insurance when they may need it.
Okay, so basically, purchase the home not during hurricane season.
Yes.
Make sure not to purchase during hurricane season, because that has been on my mind. I know it has to be on. Maybe it's on. I don't know if it's on other people's minds.
I mean, hopefully it is.
Yeah. I mean, those people who are like, I don't believe in climate change. Just don't believe in it. I'm like, oh, okay. But it's happening as we speak.
Yeah. I mean, as someone who has responded to 2 hurricanes in the last 2 months, yes, climate change is real.
Yeah.
We all together learned the Greek alphabet in the summer of 2020 hurricane season,
Yeah.
where we went through every letter and then moved on to the Greek alphabet. So climate change is real and we need to prepare for it.
So what causes hurricanes, or how does climate change cause hurricanes?
So I am not a climatologist, so I don't
Okay.
want to speak to the exact science behind it, but hurricanes are typically caused because of either dust coming off of Africa or warmer water in the Gulf is makes you more vulnerable to hurricanes. So there's El Nino and La Nina; those affect the frequency or the likelihood of hurricanes as well. So there's a lot of atmospheric science that I don't understand all of it, but I know that it influences what we see every hurricane season.
Okay. So as the waters get warmer, we get more hurricanes.
Yes, we're
Okay.
more vulnerable to them.
Okay. Okay. So this whole little coastal area is just gonna be all right.
And the Gulf. I don't know if you've been in the Gulf of Mexico lately, but it is just bath water in the summer. It is so hot in the water. I'll get in the water and I'm like, oh God, a hurricane just would love this. Like, I'm just like, there's like some existential dread happening
Yes.
there. Like, oh, this water is so warm. This is so bad.
As
Yeah.
you're trying to relax, you're just like, oh wait, oh wait. As you're
Yep.
enjoying the spring weather in the fall, you're like, oh, this feels so nice, and you're like, oh, this is not good. Oh,
Yeah.
this
This is
is
going to be very bad.
it's not like 80 degrees in November. No.
Oh God.
Jen, thank you so much for showing up today despite all of the technical difficulties. My apologies.
No worries.
So many things happened. I lost my car on my way here. Well, I forgot where I parked it because I parked it in the parking garage across from my apartment, and I had not moved it. I had not been to my car in days. So sometimes I park on the second floor, sometimes I park on the sixth floor. I'm supposed to park on the sixth floor because I reside there, but I was like, okay, I went up there. It wasn't there. Couldn't find it. Had to go all the way back down to the second floor. Yeah, it was. That's how it started. That's how it started. But so then I was late getting here, and then technology just said, "Fuck you." Just said, "Fuck you."
Are you still in DC?
I am. I
Nice.
am. I'm in Northeast DC. We'll see how long I stay. Because woof, these housing prices.
I know. I don't know how anyone affords to live in DC or a lot of these big cities. Even
Yeah.
Florida is becoming ridiculously expensive.
Oh yeah. Like places that were like really reasonable. You look at it now, you're like, how is Cleveland that expensive? Who's making that salary in Cleveland?
Yeah. The worst part though is when you see what they paid for it in like 1997, like, oh, they paid 50 grand for the house and now they want 400. Like, I'm not paying you that. Like,
Yeah, it's ridiculous. I was just like, when are these? I was like, when are these housing prices going to drop?
I know.
Um, you know, so that a single woman, single black woman in the district can afford one.
Yeah.
Maybe you can't.
Seamus needs a bigger abode.
He does. He
Yeah.
really, really does. I was like, I told my mom, I was like, I can't downgrade in terms of size of an apartment. I was like, I can't do that. I was like, no. I was like, because Seamus has to have a crate. He has to have somewhere that he has to go, and he's driving me nuts.
Mm-hmm.
There has to be a separate room, a separate something, just for us to, continue to reside together. And yeah, it's yeah, these housing prices, these rental prices are out of control.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So it's like making it's the reason why I think some women are like, let me find some man who's just okay, just all
No,
right to split these bills.
no, thank you.
You're
No.
like,
Ladies, do not do that. You'll regret it. Wait for the right one, please. I speak from experience.
Oh,
Wait, there's a good one that will come along.
yes.
I found him. You will find him too.
Yeah. I've thought about it, and I'm like, no. I don't want to share a refrigerator. I don't want to share a refrigerator with that person. No.
Mm-mm.
Or a bathroom with that person. You have to think about that. Do I want to share a bathroom with this person?
God, even the people that you just adoringly love, sharing a bathroom with them is a rough situation.
Yes.
My husband and I do not share a bathroom because I just can't. Like, you over here, me over here, everything's happy now.
Right? I remember my friend's parents did that. Like, they got separate bathrooms. Like, they remodeled their house. And that's the first thing they did. Like, they each had separate toilets. They had separate showers. Everyone's like, you got separate everything? They're like, she was like, yes, it's necessary. I was like, you know what? I get it. Well, Jen, thank you so much for coming. And I want to thank everyone for listening in. Please write in about any questions, comments, or concerns. And if you think you really get it, send in some answers. Be sure to follow She Really Gets It on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and wherever else podcasts are found.